This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Brian Young.
And today we are going to talk about a character who's actually popped up in a few different places. He is a historical figure that, it comes up time and again whenever we talk about people that are sort of big, interesting personalities. When people tell their stories, often they get embellished in different ways depending on who is doing the telling. So today we are talking about Captain Nemo, who has a pretty interesting life story, some of which you may or may not know, depending on what aspects of it you have been exposed to. And he definitely was a larger-than-life type character, very eccentric and very fascinating, and we're going to unravel some of that today.
I like unraveling that.
Indeed. Let's do it. So to understand Nemo, we actually have to travel back to the early 1800s in the independent territory of Bundelkund, which I am probably mispronouncing, but that is my best stab at it. And that is a region of present-day India.
The Raja of Bundelkund had a son, Prince Dakkar, and while Prince Dakkar undoubtedly enjoyed a number of benefits and delights that a child of royalty would have, his father, the Raja, understood that such an upbringing was not enough.
And for that reason, when Dakkar was 10 years old, he was actually sent away to Europe. And the Raja's hope was that his son would receive a more complete and thorough education and come to understand the world by being educated elsewhere. And this really was a long-term plan because the Raja wanted his son as an adult to be able to elevate their country to that of any of the finest European nations.
And so for 2 full decades, Dakkar traveled through the entire European continent. He was a smart young man. He readily absorbed any and all information he could, and he was particularly interested in art, literature, and science, but he studied every topic he was presented with enthusiasm.
And as a traveling scholar from a royal family, he really drew quite a wide range of admirers and invitations to all manner of social engagements. And it really was the kind of life that could easily lead most people into a sort of debauched and indolent existence. Hi, I'm a wealthy kid and everybody wants to party with me. But Dakkar fell into no such trap.
He remained consistently focused on becoming the man his father wished him to be, a man worthy of ruling his people and bettering his country, and this seriousness was coupled with a quest for knowledge that seemed to know no bounds.
And so serious was he about his study that he actually mastered those subjects that he loved most dearly almost at the same level as someone who devotes themselves exclusively to that one path rather than the several that Dakkar was studying. So he really developed as an artist and as a person who is extremely knowledgeable about art history. He also became a master of philosophy and particularly its relation to politics. And his obsession with science was pretty much unsurpassed.
And after 20 years of more or less constant study, in 1849 it was time for Prince Dakkar to travel back to his home. He was married shortly thereafter, and he and his wife had 2 children together. His home life was, by all accounts, quite contented. But this was also the time of Company Raj, when the British East India Company held dominion over large parts of India. And the beginning of Company Raj is a matter of some debate, but the earliest moment that historians point to is the Battle of Plessy in 1757.
And while there were significant advancements in India's infrastructure under the British East India Company, there was naturally unrest that another country had come in and taken away most of the power from the indigenous leadership. And keep in mind that the advancements led by the BEIC were really all for the advantage of the company. They weren't particularly for the benefit of India's people.
It was these circumstances that fomented the unrest in India that ultimately led to a conflict known by multiple names: the Indian Revolt of 1857, the Sepoy Revolt, and the Indian Mutiny, among others. The word Sepoy referred to the Indian men who were employed by the British East India Company's armies. The word has roots in the Persian word for soldier or horseman, and the Sepoys began the mutiny against the company.
And for his part, Prince Dakkar saw this uprising as a means to an end. He had always intended that Bundelkund should be independent, and he thought that this could actually be completely achieved by backing this revolt. So once he had committed to doing so, he followed through in every possible way. Not only did he contribute a great deal of money to the effort, but he contributed his very self.
He fought on the front lines in 20 different engagements. He was injured in 10 of them and seemed to have a death wish. Ultimately, the uprising was suppressed by the British, though there had been a great deal of carnage by the time it ended.
Yeah, that's the Indian Revolt of 1857 is pretty routinely described as being just incredibly brutal and grisly from both sides, and a really heavy amount of bloodshed and loss for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And the personal impact of the failed revolt for Prince Dakkar was unavoidable. It was absolutely no secret that he had fought alongside the Sepoys and that he had supported the uprising financially. And as a consequence, the British issued a bounty for him.
He managed to evade capture and return to Bundelkund, but he'd lost everything. His wife and children had been tortured to death during the revolt. Home held neither joy nor peace for him.
And so he finally decided that the best course of action was to turn his back on all that he had known, and he decided to live apart from civilization, free of the rules of any nation. And he took a handful of trusted and loyal friends and advisors. You'll hear that number reported in different amounts. Some put it around 10 or 15, others as high as 24. Usually you'll see a round number of about 20. And he took all those people and he vanished from his homeland.
He eventually made his way to an uninhabited isle in the Pacific Ocean, and there, he set up a dockyard and dedicated himself once more to science. But unlike during his European travels, when he studied simply for the joy of learning, this time he was driven by a purpose. And that purpose was developing new technologies to be used in building a submarine unlike any that had come before it.
This is when Dakkar adopted the name Nemo, which in Latin means nobody, and he did that at some point after he left the Asian continent, although we're not exactly certain when he made the switch, or if it just sort of subtly and slowly happened over time. But under that name, he became the captain of this submarine, which he called the Nautilus. And the prince and his men, who became his crew, had figured out ways to harness power for the sub that seemed like they never depleted, and they were able to fit out their underwater home with virtually every utility and luxury that they could require.
Once the Nautilus was completed, Nemo took to the sea on a seemingly endless adventure. He visited virtually every part of the underwater world on Earth, gathering treasures as he went. And as he amassed fortunes that had been lost at sea, he didn't keep them or spend them on frivolities. Instead, he sought out occupied countries where people were fighting for independence and donated generously to those causes of self-governance.
Yeah, it seemed like he never really lost his sense of what had happened in that revolt and how India had been treated. On November 6th of 1866, 3 men ended up on the Nautilus after the sub and the U.S. frigate Abraham Lincoln collided in the water. The men had been aboard the Abraham Lincoln, but they had gone overboard when the two vessels engaged, and they had ended up clinging to the side of the Nautilus. The Lincoln, which had been in pursuit of the sub, first launched a harpoon at the Nautilus, which the Nautilus answered by sweeping the frigate with its ballast pumps, then counterattacking and destroying the ship's rudder, and so in that sweep was when the men were cast overboard.
The men informed Nemo that his sub, the Nautilus, was sought after by basically every nation. Information that was news to the prince. It was believed to be a sea monster by most, and it had caused damage to a number of ships. And that was why the USS Abraham Lincoln had pursued it.
Nemo decided that he had to keep the men as prisoners, and he did so for 7 months, as he took them along on his many fascinating voyages. The men, marine biologist Professor Pierre Aronnax, his servant Conseil, and a whaler named Ned Land, found Nemo and his ship both fascinating and fantastic and frightening. And initially, Nemo refused to answer their questions, and the men, thinking that he might be mute, were conferring among themselves.
He eventually revealed that he has understood all that they had said, and they marveled that he could speak all of their languages, of course not knowing of his 20 years in Europe, learning virtually every language spoken there.
Yeah, so this is the first time we really get a sense of his sort of super weird behavior after he has become this alternate person that he's sort of created for himself. And it is only the beginning of some very, very eccentric behavior. So as the three men were absorbing that information that he, one, could speak quite beautifully in all of their languages, he let them know that they would be perfectly safe aboard the Nautilus, but that is also the conversation where he revealed to them that they were his captives.
Nemo doled out small bits of information about his life in the Nautilus to his three prisoners over time. He took Aronnax on an underwater hunt and also showed him shipwrecks as though they were some sort of tourist destinations for undersea travelers.
And a unique defense of the Nautilus was revealed when Nemo's decision to stop in the Torres Strait left them open to attack from cannibals. And as this tribe descended on the sub, the captain activated an electric current which ran through its hull, so it shocked the attackers without mortally wounding them.
Nemo's behavior with his prisoner guests was erratic and inconsistent. While at times he shared the secrets and wonders of the life that he and his crew lived in their submarine home, other times he became sullen or treated the men cruelly.
Yeah, at one point he actually drugged all of them, and then sort of left them, moved them all back into their rooms, kind of captivated. And Aronnax realized as he was fighting off this engulfing stupor that Nemo must have done so, meaning that he had drugged them, in order to work on projects that he didn't want these three men to know about.
Not long after this drugging incident, Nemo approached Aronnax to ask him about his credentials as a physician. He eventually revealed that he had a crew member in need of medical attention, and Aronnax agreed to see the man. Aronnax intuited that somehow the illness he was being asked to minister to might have been related to whatever secret activities had warranted drugging him and his companions. And when he saw his patient, it only confirmed to him that something bad had happened.
So this poor sailor's skull had been shattered, and at this point, a portion of his brain was actually exposed. And the cause of this grave injury was, according to Captain Nemo, an accident involving the Nautilus's machinery, but he wouldn't really say much more than that. Aronnax determined that the man was soon going to die, and when he gave Nemo this news, the captain actually really surprised him by breaking down and crying. And he further surprised the professor by staging a funeral of sorts in the Coral Kingdom for the deceased man, burying him wrapped in white linen in an underwater grave.
Captain Nemo's familiarity with the undersea realms of the globe offered him incredible insights and opportunities. While finding lost treasure at sea garnered an impressive income, he also fed giant oysters so that they would grow the most massive and valuable pearls possible.
Yeah, so he was funding all of his projects, but also, again, he was giving this money away to freedom fighters in various nations. And Nemo had also discovered this passage that enabled him to travel from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And he had discovered this thing that he called the Arabian Tunnel after observing similar fish in each body of water. And he, at one point, tagged some of the fish to test whether there was travel between the two bodies of water. And when he caught some of them in the second location later, his theory was proven, and so he set about discovering the tunnel, which was actually below the Suez Canal.
And that seemingly endless power, Nemo had discovered underwater coal mines, places where, the captain told Aronnax, the sea covers entire forests embedded during geological periods, now mineralized and transformed into coal. For me, they are an inexhaustible mine.
Yeah, there's a whole other curious scientific thing that is a little bit elusive in how they would be mining coal underwater, but Nemo had figured it out. And in doing so, he really did circle the globe repeatedly, never touching foot on land, allegedly, once he left it. And his flag was even planted in the ice at the South Pole, and that was a feat that he managed while he had his captives aboard the sub.
Despite his mercurial and unpredictable behavior, one thing seemed consistent in Nemo's personality, and that was his attachment to his crew. When the Nautilus was attacked by either giant squid or octopuses, there's actually some debate about the translation of Aronnax's French writings into English on this particular detail. He lost another crew member and was thrown into a deep depression.
And it's important to note here that everything we know about Nemo during this time is through the writings of Aronnax. So it's worth considering that when he describes this seeming madman traveling the world's oceans in a submarine fitted out with art and an organ and other luxuries most people on land didn't even have, that it's likely not the full story. And that's not to cast aspersions on Aronnax as a record keeper, but it's always good to remember when examining historical accounts that each of them has only the writer's point of view, and that without multiple versions of events to compare, we're probably not getting the whole story.
Having said that, eventually, when Aronnax had seized a chance to escape, he witnessed as he aggressed the captain playing the Nautilus's organ. The last words Aronnax heard Nemo utter were, "God Almighty, enough, enough."
Yeah, he definitely seemed to have some demons. And so on June 22nd of 1867, Nemo's captives escaped the Nautilus, while the sub was caught in a maelstrom off the coast of Norway. And as his vessel had been mercilessly tossed about, Nemo believed that the three men must have perished. But of course they did not, because it was Aronnax's account that first gave the world details about the Nautilus and its enigmatic captain in the first place.
For his part, Nemo continued to travel, but he outlived his small trusted crew. He laid each of his fallen men to rest at sea in the Pacific, and then when he was the lone survivor, he brought his sub into port under a volcanic island where he stayed alone for 6 years as he waited for his own mortality to catch up to him. But before it did, fate once again threw strangers in his path.
So this time, it was 5 men who had been in a balloon, and they had made their way into the air, but then they were caught in a storm, and they ended up crash landing on the same island where Nemo had docked the Nautilus.
Initially, Nemo saw the men, but they weren't aware of him, and he stayed incognito. And when they first crashed, Nemo was underwater in his diving suit, and so was able to remain hidden.
And the solitary prince knew that he couldn't get the Nautilus out of dock unobserved by these people. So he just decided he had to stay put. And as this group struggled to survive on the island, which they named Lincoln Island in honor of President Abraham Lincoln, Nemo performed various acts of assistance anonymously. Life-saving took place, supply dropping, canoe saving, escape route creating, and more all happened at Nemo's hands. But to the castaways, they had no idea that that was the case. They had no explanation for these various mysterious and seemingly miraculous events that were assisting them along in their survival.
Eventually, after observing the men for some time and eavesdropping on their conversations, Nemo determined that these castaways were good people. He allowed them to board the Nautilus at this point, and there he relayed his life story to them, most likely because he knew that he was at the end of his life.
He also asked the men for their judgment, and this is a really sort of poignant and sad moment in this account, because it seemed that at the end he was seeking some sort of peace with the actions of his life, particularly his treatment of Aronnax Land and Conseil when they were his prisoners, as well as his conflicts with other vessels at sea.
One of the men, Cyrus Harding, took Nemo's hand and said, "Sir, your error was in supposing the past can be resuscitated and in contending against inevitable progress. It is one of those errors which some admire, others blame, which God alone can judge. He who is mistaken in an action which he sincerely believes to be the right may be the enemy, but retains our esteem. Your error is one that we may admire, and your name has nothing to fear from the judgment of history, which does not condemn heroic folly, but its results."
And those men stayed with Nemo as his life slowly ebbed from his body, and the captain made known to them his desire to die aboard the Nautilus, and he asked the men if they would fulfill his last wishes, which they agreed to do, knowing that the now frail man had in fact ensured their survival at Lincoln Island, so they all felt they owed him a debt.
"Tomorrow after my death," he told them, "yourself and your companion will leave the Nautilus, for all the treasures it contains must perish with me. One token alone will remain with you of Prince Dakkar, with whose history you are now acquainted." He then directed them to a coffer filled with valuable diamonds and pearls. He told the men that he believed money would not be dangerous in their hands, and that he would watch them from on high, presumably meaning in the afterlife.
And he instructed them further on how to sink the Nautilus, and they agreed to do all this. And when he asked them to leave him alone for a little while, the men discussed among themselves the fact that they could take the Nautilus to escape the island. But ultimately, honor prevailed, and they agreed to uphold their promise to do as Captain Nemo requested.
They once again returned to the dying prince, who spoke to them of the importance of one's country as his condition continued to weaken. Finally, he quietly called out, "God and my country," and then died. True to their word, the men scuttled the Nautilus, and it became Nemo's undersea tomb. Its internal light sources illuminated the darkness of the ocean depths as it sank, until finally, the men could see no more light from it.
So while Cyrus Harding and his fellow survivors had intended that if they got off of the island that they would return at some point, the volcano at its center actually erupted. It tore the island apart, and they managed to stay alive on a tiny piece of land that remained, and they were eventually rescued on that piece, which is how we got this end of his life story. They were able to retell that, and it was actually to them that he had revealed his origins as Prince Dakar. That had never been known by Aronnax and his companions. So his life story is one that gets pieced together kind of in the wrong order by people that he sort of shared it with in unique ways.
Yeah.
I do have like a moment where I have to call out what I think is some jerkitude on his part. I mean, obviously there's some, but to me, the fact that he wanted all of these like priceless things to go down with him from like an art history perspective is really jerky.
From a scholar's perspective as well. Like, here, I've collected all of this art and history and artifacts from all of these shipwrecks around the world that no one has ever seen, and they're going down with me. That's
pretty selfish.
Yeah. This is all interesting background in that most of my exposures to Captain Nemo were part of his time, and I think it was during that 6 years where he sort of went off without his crew, and he'd been dragged into service by Alan Quatermain and some other notable people there to do some crazy things with the Nautilus. So this was all really interesting background.
Yeah, and the thing with that Alan Quatermain part of his life story is that it's really highly refuted.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating and it's really cool, but it's hard to verify. And there are people that have suggested that, it wasn't really him, but somebody else. And, it's the trick of history, and somebody like this that lives such an enigmatic life, it's hard to pin down their details.
Yeah. And you know what? That organ sounded rad. It's too bad they couldn't keep it somewhere where people could watch it and see it and hear it played every day.
I know, right? If only.
Yeah.
That's what I got on Nemo. Do you have anything else?
I've got some mail.
Fantastic. You should read that mail.
So it's, hello, Brian and Holly, writes Bobby. And she says, I was curious to know, what criteria do you look for in selecting topics for your research efforts? What do you believe makes a good story to look at in an episode? I'm very much enjoying the podcast so far. My partner just suggested it to me because I'm a fan of stuff you missed in history class, and I binge listened to it current. I binge listened until current. I would love to contribute to listener mail or episode requests, but I'm not necessarily sure what topics would interest you. But thank you for making this a lovely podcast.
Oh, so sweet.
Yeah. So for you, Holly, I don't know how much our research interests overlap, but what do you look for when selecting a topic?
It's really sort of a gut reaction. If I think it's interesting history, I suspect most people will. I'm fortunate enough to be exposed to lots of historical things all the time. And some of them I'm like, ooh, that's really interesting. And others I'm not. So the ones that make me go, ooh, are the ones that I usually pursue. How about you?
For me, a lot of it has to do with what I have access to materials-wise, because I don't want to be full of conjecture or making things up. I want to be able to
Right.
pack an episode in something that's informative, that also has details that people haven't necessarily heard about, right?
Mm.
To make it relevant, because if we were just retelling the stories everybody knows, it would get really boring.
Yeah.
So that's really what I look for, and something that could tell an interesting story. I don't know. I sort of gravitate toward battles, and you kind of gravitate toward like flora and fauna or whatever. I don't know. Like, I think we have a really good mix of interests to find things to make the show never feel the same way twice, though.
Yeah, I like a lot of cultural touch points. Like, I like to look at different cultures, almost from a sociological point of view. Whereas I'm less inclined to go after battles. Like, sometimes I will, but they're not quite as much of a draw for me usually. So yeah, it balances out.
Yeah. Well,
but I want to make sure that we say, like, if you have an idea, send it.
Yeah.
It may or may not get to the top of the list right away, but we'll put it on the list.
Yeah. No, there is definitely a list.
Yeah. Yeah, no idea is a bad idea. Whether we end up using it or not, like, we can't make any promises. But it's still always worth sharing ideas.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Bobby, for your email, and hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
So where can people find you, Holly?
I am on Twitter as Surliest Girl. You can find me on Instagram as SurlyGirly5. You can find me at my day job, which is Missed in History. It's Stuff You Missed in History class, so Missed in History is our social media handle. And then I also do some stuff with you, so let's segue to what you do and where we can find you.
So we do the Full of Sith podcast, which is a Star Wars podcast, and we talk about that a lot. And I write for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider, and you can follow me on Twitter at Swankmatron, and you can find my writing, my fiction writing, in various places across the internet, and I write for a whole bunch of other websites as well. And if you would like to send us an email here to Fothentic History, you can go to fothentichistory.com and use the contact form there, and that's the best way to get a hold of us and look at all of our back episodes. And we would love to hear from you on Twitter, which is at Fothentics. And if you look up Fothentic History on Facebook, we're there too. And we definitely would love to hear from you, whether that's on the websites, on social media, or if you want to drop a review of the show on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever else you listen to it. We would love all that.
That sounds grand.
Do you have anything else, Holly?
Nope, just hope everybody's having a delightful summer.
Okay, well then we're done.
All right.